Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, here we are again. Yet another talking head video with my ugly head in the video. Anyways, we've got I guess multiple questions here. Truthfully, it's a long email, so I may have to break it down as we go and try to answer them, because I feel like there's several here and they may be in depth. So as always, if you have questions, reach out to me, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. YouTube comments below, any of the social media, thealchemistcabinet.com, etc., etc. You know the rule. Look out for the new Practical Distiller's Almanac coming in early February. Alan, now that winter has finally arrived in your neighbor state to the north, I made some time for a list of questions I've been pondering for your YouTube channel. I had a pretty good novel written up. If you want to read it all on the channel, great. Or if you want to summarize and do stream of consciousness on whatever comes to mind, have at it. There's a few topic categories you could divide up with other folks' related questions. Cooking small grains. When do you decide to implement a beta-glucan rest/step mash? Per recipes in your books, it seems standard with your rye recipe and most other rye recipes I've encountered. But other recipes with high rye, wheat, oats percentages, you add the small grain at 170 on the way down after cooking corn. Is this due simply to practicality, having a less complicated cook versus necessity for goo reduction, as small grains aren't cooked hot as corn? I was more focused on this step when I didn't have an on-grain distillation setup, but now with a steam rig, maybe it isn't as much of an issue. Please discuss. So I rarely really do those step mash sort of processes. The closest thing that comes to it is when I'm doing my mash-in, when I'm actually grinding in my grain, whatever grains it is, starting with corn. Let's just say for a bourbon. With corn, we set the cooker at 125. Used to do it at 135, and we hold it there while we're mashing all the grains in. Once all the grains are in, then we raise it to 190. So, you know, those grains are setting there at that temperature. And so, to be clear, at Spirits of French Lick, we actually put the rye in, the oats, the wheat, etc. at that 190 hold. It's actually being ground in at 125 and going up to 190. I've played with this all different kinds of ways. I've done it by 125 or 135 grinding in corn or rye and then going to 190, or with rye going to 170 on 100% rye, or with a high rye bourbon going to 190 then coming down to 170 and adding rye or the wheat or the oats. I can't tell that big of a difference at Spirits of French Lick, to be honest with you. Now, when I do the step mashing on the rye, like I've done at home and talked about in the videos here, I do notice a flavor difference. It's not massive, and I'm not entirely sure that anyone who wasn't just specifically tuned into what that flavor difference is would ever pick up on it. But I very rarely do it in a commercial setting. One reason is because with the equipment I have, I just honestly don't need it. If I need to be thinner, I can add some enzymes if I need to, or I can add some water if I need to and drop the specific gravity. I'm not running a column still. It's not that big of a deal on a commercial scale. At home, it does certainly make mashing in rye a little easier for sure. So just something to think about there. The other reason for not doing it commercially is because quite often, you know, I have a still hand now who's really paying attention, really involved, Justin. He even runs his own distilling podcast called Still Learning, right? And he's really interested and he wants to know how to do all these various different things. So he pays a little closer attention than maybe some of the guys in the past at the distillery have. Not knocking those guys in any way, shape, or form. They did a great job for what they did. Justin probably pays a little bit more attention to what he's doing than what those guys did. So if I wanted him to do certain rests and do certain odd numbers to stop at, etc., to hold at for a certain amount of time, he would certainly do those things. But typically in the past, it's been keep it as simple as what you can for the guy who's working the mash. And as long as the flavor and the quality is good and it's where it's at, stick with it, right? No reason to change it up. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Or if it ain't broke, don't broke it is more appropriate, I think. So additionally, can you confirm that beta-glucanase enzyme is only present / active in malted grains. In other words, a step mash with 100% unmalted rye isn't going to work. I haven't seen any data on how much malt would be needed for an effective step, small handful versus percentage guidelines. For comparison, one can calculate necessary mash bills with known DP values for malt to obtain effective conversion. I'm not aware of such values for beta-glucanase activity in malt. Per usual, I'm likely overcomplicating the concept. No, you're not overcomplicating it, and I do not know a great way of figuring that out. I can tell you that I do believe that beta-glucanase enzyme is, along with alpha and beta, in rye, raw rye, naturally. I can only say that based on a little bit of experience mashing in raw rye without any enzymes, and a whole lot of literature from the 1800s that talk about doing it. I've not done it on any scale like I need to. I've not done the experiment like I should. I've not had time, but I would like to. And yes, I do think that it is there, at least in small quantities. I don't know how you would ever figure out a formula there. I'm sure there's somebody. There's got to be a brewer out there somewhere, or a distiller somewhere that's got some knowledge on that. Hell, it might be in one of the books that I have in my library, and I might accidentally stumble on it at some point in time, and if I do, I promise I'll report back. So oats. You hype up using oats, and for good reason. I grow feed oats on farm and have been incorporating them into more recipes. I've found proper milling to require more attention than other grains, as I've used both a roller mill and a small hammer mill. I've also tried to utilize glucan rest. Relating to the above questions, it seems the preference would be to use crimped or rolled oats for ease, and I know many home-scale distillers just buy breakfast oatmeal, but I'm stubborn and I want to utilize what I grow. I don't really have a specific question, but thought maybe you could talk about some details as to how you incorporate oats into recipes and mashing with them for people that might want to experiment. So typically when we're grinding, we're using a hammer mill at Spirits of French Lick is what we're using. And we do have to run it a little slower with oats so that we don't blow all the starch into the cyclone system and into the bags, because when you're cleaning out of those bags, it's a pain in the ass. We haven't really had any problems with the oats being very overly sticky, surprisingly. I don't know why that is, and that seems to be the case whether or not I use exogenous enzymes or I don't use them and I'm just using malt for conversion. When we do 100% oat whiskey, we're typically mashing that in somewhere in the like 162 to 165 range for about 30 minutes, somewhere around there. We don't tend to have to go to those higher temperatures. And in fact, we have, even at one point in time, we're using still cut oats. So they're not even entirely ground. They're just cut. And we had fine conversion with those and no problem whatsoever. And I'd imagine those would actually lauter fairly decently. I have run oats through roller mills. That works fine as well. The big thing with oats is they're soft enough that it's not that big of a deal to get good conversion out of them, as long as they are perforated enough that the yeast can and the enzymes can get in there and work them. That seems to be the big thing there. Ideally and preferentially, I personally wouldn't, if I had a way around it, I probably wouldn't hammer mill them. I feel like the hammer mill probably heats them up a little bit too much for my preference. I also tend to notice that there seems to be better mouthfeel with the still cuts, and better mouthfeel even with the quick oats than there are with raw oats that have been hammer milled. Now, maybe that's just my perception. There may not be, I don't have any scientific backing for that. That's just what I've seen and noticed. When I was adding them in at different temperatures, so now we'll grind, say, the corn and the wheat for the Lee Sinclair mash bill and the oats all at 190. I used to go corn at 190, wheat at 170, and oats at like 165. But it got to be too much, right? It just really was. And just me being nitpicky and being a douchebag. And once I figured out you didn't have to do that, I didn't notice a quality difference there at all. So, used wood. Your love for used barrels is prevalent in many videos, and I was hoping you might elaborate or delve deeper into some details. Aging and maturation seems like half science, part magic, and a good portion of BS thrown in depending on whose mouth it's coming from / what they're selling. Comment on the industry, not you specifically. My interest relates to maturation of bourbon / all types of whiskeys. Feel free to limit that or expand as you wish. I will be doing a lot more stuff on barrels in the near future. I do love used barrels, and it's for a couple of reasons. Because A, I'm not really a bourbon guy. I make a lot of bourbon, and we win a lot of awards on bourbon, and I'm very, very proud of that. But I'm not a bourbon guy. I am truthfully a brandy guy and a all-around whiskey guy. as much as anything. And so I don't like overpowering wood, first of all. So I don't really, new oak is not really my thing. I like it, especially at home for blending, right? To be able to blend some new oak stuff as sort of a concentrate with some used oak stuff. And I like to be able to pull from used oak barrels that have some flavors that the whiskey or the brandy may not otherwise have. But more importantly, with full-size 53-gallon barrels, as you guys may or may not know, it's getting harder and harder to find cooperage. And when you do find cooperage, it may not be seasoned to what I prefer. I prefer at least a 24-month-old air-seasoned barrel, and those are becoming hard, if not impossible, to find. And when you do find them, they're running $600+. So we're getting lower and lower quality barrels, and those are even getting harder and harder to find. The beautiful thing about the older barrels, even though they're used, that's great for me because I've gotten rid of some of those wood notes that I don't want overtaking my whiskey that I put so much effort into to distill as a great white spirit as it is. But B, the oak itself was likely from barrels that were seasoned properly outside and not kiln. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so big on used oak. I also think that used oak barrels just add a character that I have a really hard time explaining, regardless of what was in them previously, that I can't really pinpoint it. I don't know if it's a product of the micro-oxidization, part of the breakdown of the wood. It's just different, and it's something that matches my more rustic aesthetic, I guess, than what is maybe popular in the United States with bourbon. So, legal definitions aside, if I age bourbon for 2 years, pulled it out, and continue to mature it in a neutral barrel / stainless, etc., allowing some oxygenation, and then utilize that same barrel for the same mash bill, and aged it for much longer, 10 years for example, how would the resulting spirit compare? Are some flavor components extracted completely, almost completely, very quickly? Or is it a more linear process? I understand the extraction versus maturation you've discussed many times. So basically, it's pretty linear for the most part. So here's what I've experienced. At Spirits of French Lick, with most of our spirits, and bear in mind we have 2 different kinds of warehouses, and that affects things as well. With most of the spirits, 6 weeks, you have almost all the color you're going to get. Not all of it, but probably a good 85-90% of the color that you're going to get. After 6 weeks, you really have a time period where at 6 months, it sort of goes to this like really heavy bread dough thing. At a year, it's still that kind of bread dough thing. Year and a half, it gets real funky, like you made something or did something wrong. 2 years, that kind of turns around and turns into this nice bread characteristic that can be a little doughy, but more like baked bread with some nice confectionery notes. At 2.5 years, it gets weird again for most of our products. Not all of them, but most of them. At 3, a lot of it is back to that dirty, just what the fuck was I thinking when I distilled this sort of thing. And then at about 3.5, 4 years, it really comes along. Get that balance of that bread, that graininess, and those beautiful barrel notes that come from the new oak barrel, right? Now, if I pulled that out and put it in stainless steel and oxidized it, well, let me go back before we even do that to talk about how linear this is. And then, because it goes linear and then it's all of a sudden. That's what happens. So let's take our rye whiskey. So we purposely didn't release it until it was 5 years old. Everything else we released at 4 years old. I wanted to hold on to rye until it was 5 because all the other craft distillers were releasing rye at 2 years old and bourbon at 4 or 5. I wanted to do the opposite. When that rye got to 5, it was gorgeous. It became one of my top 2 favorite products that I've ever made as far as like on the mainstream, mainline products that we've done. At 6 years old, no. At 5.5, great. At 6 years old, straight up trash. I don't know what changes. I don't know what happens at that period in the barrel. At 7 years old, right back at it. Like an enhanced version of what it was at 5 years old. So linear, but not always linear. Now, if you took it out, put it stainless, and let it oxidize, I actually think that that's a jump start on getting a well-aged spirit. Either oxidizing prior to the barrel or oxidizing at some point when you take it out of the barrel, put it in something else, oxidize it, put it into another barrel. If I were going to do a double oak, for example, that's exactly what I do. I wouldn't go back into the same barrel I used. I'd go back into a new barrel of some kind right? But now you're talking a lot of oak influence coming to the forefront. But you also have all that oxidization of all those alcohols that you had go in the first place, right? And all that esterification is going to be bumped forward because of that. I think I kind of roundabout answered that question. That's a hard one to answer, and I'm gonna have to think on that a little bit more. I see what you're saying. I just got to get my mind there. Small format barrels are garbage, Alan Bishop. But hear me out for thought experiment. Too much surface area is the issue, but if one used a second use small barrel, could the extraction flavors be more balanced to allow a more effective longer aging time, especially if the environment could be modified to reduce angel share? I ask because on my current home scale, the economic time production sweet spot for me seems larger than a bad mo size, though I've made several, and I'm obviously not on the commercial scale. I see exactly what you're saying. I still don't think it's the case. The only barrels I've seen, even from a used perspective on the smaller side, that are worthwhile, in my opinion, from having experimented with multiples of them over the years, are the 15-gallon formats. And then, of course, 25s and 30s. I don't know why the 15s seem to work better. They just seem to work better. Now, an interesting thing that does seem to work is taking a full-size 53, if you can find a used one somewhere for cheap, and only filling it a quarter of the way, if a quarter of the way, and then having all that extra room for oxidization. I know that Wilderness Trail did something like that with their sorghum rum, and it's wonderful at a year old, or was wonderful. I don't know if they still have any more of it left or not. So that's something to think about. But other than that, I've never had any luck with those small barrels, whether they're new or used, until you get up to that 15-gallon size format. And that's very specific. McGinnis Wood Products, both their American oak as well as their Missouri oak. If the previous bourbon was low or high entry proof, should I utilize different proof for a corn whiskey, single malt, etc. that follows? Could you discuss some of the factors involved when making these types of decisions? So typically, that's exactly what I'll do. I will go to a higher proof when I go into a used barrel. Unless I'm just finishing a bourbon or something of that nature. But if I'm going to put a new apple brandy in, or I'm going to put a new single malt whiskey in, or a new American whiskey in, I go to a higher proof. A, because typically with those styles of whiskey, my distillation, I'm trying to hold on to more of those grain profiles, or as much of that grain flavor as what I possibly can. But B, because I don't want to micro-oxidize in the same way I would a bourbon. And C, I'm trying not to saponify. And D, I also feel like you're pulling some more of that flavor of that previous spirit that was in the wood out of the wood and into the product. So if I want to go further down the rabbit hole, you could discuss some considering factors for utilizing X rum brandy wine cask. In these cases, I assume you're opting for very little barrel character, as most has already been extracted by previous spirits, but instead focused on the complementary flavors from the residual spirit wine still in the wood. That's exactly what I'm after. But I am also after the little bit of the wood that is left there to yet fall apart or degrade into a menstruum, right? So I am looking for the barrel to have some decent deal of influence, but let's say that I want 50% of what came from the still, from the farm through fermentation through distillation. I always want 50% regardless of what kind of barrel I'm using. That's me, that's my style, that's my methodology. If I go with this and I go into a previously used barrel, what I want from that previously used barrel is about 35% of what was in that barrel, right? And then the remainder I want to be what that barrel itself can contribute, as well as the micro-oxidization. And I want those things to marry in such a way that it balances everything out, if that makes sense. What I don't want, though, as well on that 35% side, I don't want wet barrels, right? For me, a wet barrel is, I don't see a difference between if you send me a wet port barrel and I actually put whiskey into it, let's say a wet barrel's got a gallon in it, I don't see a difference between that and pouring a gallon of port into the whiskey itself, if that makes sense. It seems a little bit like a cheat. And if I'm going to do that, I'm not going to do it in a cheating way. I'm going to do it by telling the public exactly what I've done. Hey, I took a barrel, put whiskey in it, I put a gallon of port in it. It's not finished. It's probably fall under a blended whiskey or something of that nature. At home, that's completely fine. At work, it's entirely different. And it's all about being transparent to the consumer. So there's a lot of good stuff here, enough for multiple episodes, and I am going to come back to this, and I will probably deep dive some of these in the next few weeks, because I think there's more here that I can touch on that I can't get out in one video, and hell, we're already at 20 minutes. So I hope I didn't ramble too much, guys. I love y'all. Keep warm. Later.